Released for the PS4 on the 15th of March 2016, Salt and Sanctuary is a 2D take on what I've come to classify as the Souls genre of games, but more on that later. Salt and Sanctuary was developed by Ska Studios, a husband and wife indie dev team consisting only of James and Michelle Silva. Understood in this context, this game is nothing short of an absolute triumph. I thought it was important to establish this context at the outset of this video, before we set out to discuss some of the ways in which this game also represents a missed opportunity. More than anything else, this game serves as an instructive case study in what can happen when developers fail to reconcile how their games are marketed on the one hand, with how they actually feel to play on the other. There is also, I think, an important lesson to be learned here concerning the heterogeneity of gamers as a group. It is crucial, in my view, for developers to not only acknowledge these differences, but also to account for them in the games they design. By the same token, I think this whole episode demonstrates rather clearly that gamers are doing themselves no favors by excusing poor design decisions on behalf of game developers. So, in this inaugural installment of Aegon Rants, we're going to be looking at how Salt and Sanctuary managed to be both an absolute triumph and a massive disappointment. Salt and Sanctuary was first announced when James Silva made a guest post on the PlayStation blog in late August 2014, where he aptly described the game as, quote, a stylistic, brutal action RPG platformer that's teeming with visceral, satisfying combat, deep, diverse character builds, and some of the most incredible bosses we've ever made, end quote, and as a game that, quote, is inspired as much by our history as a studio as it is by old classics like Castlevania DS and new classics like the Souls series, end quote. This early reveal sums up rather nicely both the allure of the game and its eventual marketing strategy. That is, this is a game which endeavors to capitalize not only on the present popularity of the Souls games, but also to draw out and stoke the feelings of nostalgia that are latent within these games. And to be clear, I'm pointing this out not to criticize Ska Studios, but to illustrate what initially intrigued me so much about the game. But it wasn't through this blog post that I first heard about Salt and Sanctuary, and I would wager that the vast majority of those who would eventually purchase the game heard about it not through this blog post, but through VaatiVidya. On the 7th of January 2015, VaatiVidya published a Salt and Sanctuary preview video titled 2D Souls, and it was this video, I think, that was most crucial in not only drumming up hype for the game, but also in solidifying its status as a 2D Souls game, and I don't think this was a mistake. VaatiVidya is, after all, the most popular Souls-related YouTuber. So if you're Ska Studios and you want to draw attention to the extent to which your game provides an experience akin to that of the Souls games, then what do? You provide a pre-release copy of the game to the most popular Souls-related YouTuber, and you hope that he enjoys it enough to make a video about it. And again, I'm not saying this to criticize VaatiVidya or Ska Studios, but to point to the fact that Salt and Sanctuary wasn't branded as a 2D Souls game by accident. This association was cultivated purposely, not only in how the game was marketed, but also in how the game itself was designed. And this point was wonderfully articulated by VaatiVidya in this way.
The game feels familiar. You know when you pick up an FPS game and you know how it works right off the bat because you've played other first-person shooters? It's kind of like that. There's block, parry, roll, light attack, strong attack, jump, guard breaks, a dedicated healing potion, and a stamina bar that works identically to those in the Souls games. But the familiarity goes further than just controls. It's in so many elements of the game's design, and there's so many moments in the game where things just click for you. I felt this as soon as I fought my way to the deck of the ship and saw what I was facing. You know how the Asylum demon in Dark Souls is kind of like, "Hi, welcome to Dark Souls, I'll be your tutorial." Well, Salt and Sanctuary was clearly inspired by that, because you're not exactly expected to get this boss first go. You're actually supposed to die to this boss to progress, and I guess in that regard it's more similar to Demon Souls, where you're supposed to die, but there is a reward for succeeding. I have no idea what you get for succeeding in Salt and Sanctuary though, because understandably I do die here, but I don't feel too bad about it.
Needless to say, this video left me feeling really excited for this game. It was initially slated to be released in 2015, and I found myself checking the Salt and Sanctuary subreddit every few weeks, hoping to hear something, anything, concerning a release date. Ultimately, the game wound up being delayed until March 2016, and as soon as it was available on the PlayStation Store, I pre-ordered the game so that I might begin live streaming my blind playthrough as soon as the clock struck midnight. And as those of you who enjoy watching my live streams know all too well, I don't live stream very often. So that should give you some indication as to not only how excited I was for this game, but also as an indication of its status in my mind as a legitimate entry into the Souls genre. So in the midst of a particularly busy period in my personal and professional lives, I set aside several hours across several days for a series of Salt and Sanctuary live streams, the first of which you're currently looking at. But for reasons that will become apparent in just a moment, this would also be my last Salt and Sanctuary live stream. Okay, block offhand is L2, roll is R2? Use item, what is with these controls? Can you seriously not change them? Guys, I don't like this at all. Why can't you remap the buttons? But you can expect it, because if because they are more or less explicitly trying to be a 2D Souls game. And so if you're trying to be a 2D Souls game, why is R2 roll? And what's more is, why can't you just remap them? Well, go find your princess. You know what they say, a quest goes a long way to keeping the madness at bay. So yeah, it's straight Souls themes. Just no Souls controls, because yeah, I can't give this game my recommendation at this point. But I'm going to try and get used to the controls that the game comes with. Press the wrong button. Sure, let's offer these things. Oh, cool. What up? Oh, it's okay. Because they didn't want to. Nice. I can't remember what he said. I imagine they want to give a unique touch to it rather than, well, but then they shouldn't have made a 2D Dark Souls game. Yeah, like, it's fine if you want to give your own spin on something, but like, to have messages like this, and like just everything about the game screams, this is a 2D Dark Souls game. So, as you've just seen, I was incredibly disappointed with Salt and Sanctuary. I found that I simply couldn't get used to the non-rebindable control scheme the game shipped with. And while we'll explore the reasons why I couldn't adapt to the control scheme shortly, I wanted to point out that until I picked the game back up in order to capture footage for this video, this was the last time I played Salt and Sanctuary. In light of the context we've just established, it's not entirely surprising that I failed to adequately articulate what makes these controls so very problematic. So that's why I decided to make this video, to explore not only my own negative first impression of the game, but also to reflect on some of the community discourse concerning the controls in the aftermath of the game's release. But let's start with the community discourse, beginning first with this March 16th post from the Bloodborne subreddit, which reads in part, quote, "Until Dark Souls 3 comes out, there is a neat little game called Salt and Sanctuary which released on the PS4 just a couple days ago. The game is basically exactly Bloodborne as a 2D side-scroller. The game has a good atmosphere, a cool soundtrack, fun combat, a huge skill tree, and a big world. Personally, I'm playing this until Dark Souls 3 releases, and I can only recommend it." End quote. It was in response to this post that I more clearly articulated my problem with the game and its controls, when I said, in part, quote, "Be warned, in spite of being marketed almost exclusively as a 2D Souls game, Salt and Sanctuary uses a control scheme that is nothing like any of the Souls games. Unfortunately, you cannot remap the controls, and no alternative control schemes are provided. While, to be sure, you can remap the buttons using the PS4's accessibility functions, this applies to everything, including the console dashboard, the in-game button prompts, and menu systems. So while it is possible to play Salt and Sanctuary using the control schemes to which you've become accustomed, this proved incredibly confusing for me. To be clear, I am not saying the game itself is bad. On the contrary, as best as I can tell, it is a fantastic game, especially for a two-person dev team. But if, like me, your muscle memory is very strongly tied to the traditional Souls control scheme, you may have a really bad time with this game. This is made all the more frustrating by the fact that, once again, this game seems to be really good. I just can't get used to the controls. In short, though it appears to be a wonderful game, Salt and Sanctuary's default non-rebindable control scheme is counterintuitive for those whose muscle memory is strongly associated with the traditional Souls control scheme. This may not apply to you at all, but if it does, proceed with extreme caution." End quote. In response to this, one Redditor replied by asking, "Can people just not adapt to different controls anymore? This is such a ridiculous thing to deter anybody from playing. The control scheme they have works great for the game they made." End quote. I replied in turn by reiterating that, quote, "It may very well not be a problem for most people, but everyone is different, affecting not only how we become accustomed to the controller itself, or control schemes, but also the extent to which we've played certain games. In my case, I've played Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 1 and 2 prior to that, more than any one person ought to have ever played these games. So my muscle memory has kept me from enjoying this game, which, once again, was marketed aggressively as a 2D Souls game. And while the same may not be true for even 10% of this subreddit, I still think it's something that everyone needs to consider before potentially wasting money on a game they simply cannot enjoy," end quote. And while the discourse that followed was no more productive than this brief exchange, I do want to highlight a few additional comments before we move on. A Reddit user by the name of Mythic Rain argued that, quote, "It sounds like it has controls which are absolutely intuitive to anyone who has played a 2D action game before, which is probably most of the people who have played a Souls game and then some. This is not a negative. Try and adapt." In short, the message this person was trying to get across was, get good, bro. When I responded by pointing out that non-rebindable controls in 2016 is absolutely a negative, another user replied by asking whether I would apply this logic equally to Bloodborne. So we're going to explore this question in addition to that which was implied by Mythic Rain's reply, which reads, quote, "Only if they're objectively inconvenient and hinder gameplay. From the sound of it, the controls are just what any seasoned gamer would expect. Marketing this game as a Souls-like experience doesn't in any way infer that the controls would be the same, especially based on the fact that it's a 2D side-scroller instead of a full 3D experience. A lapse in logic and incorrect expectations are not a fault of the game, but a fault of the user," end quote. Notwithstanding the unidirectional victim-blaming logic employed by Mythic Rain in his reply, there were two interesting questions which arose out of these exchanges. First, if I'm criticizing Salt and Sanctuary for having non-rebindable controls, should I not also be criticizing the Souls series of games for the exact same thing? And second, did the fault lie with me, and me alone, for having been unable to adapt to the controls in Salt and Sanctuary? But let's start with the first question. If I'm complaining about non-rebindable controls in Salt and Sanctuary, is it not also incumbent upon me to apply the same critique to the Souls games? The answer to this question is yes, but also no. Allow me to explain. First and foremost, it's important for us to establish that there is nothing natural or inevitable about the input methods we use to control games. It follows from this starting point that all control schemes are, to some extent, completely arbitrary. This does not mean, however, that all control schemes are created equal. Some control schemes are more arbitrary than others, and some less so. But as this is a discussion which would probably be better suited for its own video, we'll leave it at that for now, and proceed to have a closer look at the control scheme used in Dark Souls. What makes this control scheme more or less arbitrary than the alternatives? Consider for starters the shoulder buttons. It can be easy to forget how elegant this arrangement is, to have the left shoulder buttons controlling the left arm of the player character, and the right shoulder buttons controlling the right arm. Even though, as we've already established, no control scheme can ever be natural. This is about as close as you can get in the context of this sort of game. I mean, there's even a logic to the specific functions mapped to each row of the shoulder buttons. That is, it takes less effort to press R1 than it does to press R2, so it makes intuitive sense for R1 to correspond to light attacks, while R2 activates a heavy attack. By the same token, it makes perfect sense that the abrupt motion of a parry would be mapped to the L2 trigger, while a slight press of the L1 button results in the subtle raising of a shield. This input symmetry serves to minimize the inevitable sense of dissonance we all experience while playing video games. We are, after all, still playing a video game, so it's impossible to eliminate this sensation entirely. What game designers can do, however, is craft an experience which allows us to periodically forget that we're holding a controller. There will, of course, always come a point when we remember that we have a controller in our hands, but the best, most immersive games are most often those capable of adequately spacing out these immersion-breaking moments, allowing the player to immerse themselves in the game world for hours at a time, without having to stop every 5 minutes to ask themselves, which button do I press to heal again? I can and have played the Souls games for several hours at a time before having my immersion broken by this sensation, which, for the purpose of this video, we'll just call Input Dissonance. My time with Salt and Sanctuary, on the other hand, has been regularly punctuated by Input Dissonance. There have been times where I'm jumping from one platform to the next, successfully executing mid-air attack combos, and feeling fully immersed in this beautifully crafted game world. But this sense of immersion persists only until I take a few hits, forcing me to ask myself, which button do I press to heal again? To reiterate, none of this is to suggest that the Souls control scheme isn't itself arbitrary. After all, even though the trigger buttons are mapped intuitively, there is nothing intuitive about how the face buttons are mapped. There's nothing natural or inevitable about using items by pressing the square button, or about running by holding the circle button. But this is also a control scheme that is anchored by 4 inputs that are incredibly intuitive, and these are arguably the most essential inputs to boot. You could of course argue that the traditional Souls control scheme becomes more arbitrary when transplanted into a 2D environment, and I would agree with that assessment. Part of what makes the controls in the Souls games so very intuitive is in how it allows you to move seamlessly through a 3D game world. Some of this intuitiveness is lost when applying this control scheme to a 2D game world, but even then, this control scheme would still be far less arbitrary than that which shipped with Sultan Sanctuary. So with all that said, let's return to our question. If I'm complaining about non-rebindable controls in Sultan Sanctuary, is it not also incumbent upon me to apply the same critique to the Souls games? My answer to this question is, simply put, no. That is, on the basis of the arguments I've just laid out, there is virtually no need for rebindable controls in the Souls series. The only clear-cut exception to this statement is the mapping of the jump button, which in Dark Souls 1 demanded that players hold the block button while running in order to ensure that when they wanted to roll, they could roll instead of actually jumping. And even though it's far from a perfect solution, Dark Souls 2 and 3 address this issue by giving players the option to rebind jump to the L3 button. Now, having said all of that, I'm also obliged to admit that every gamer is unique, and that even though I have no qualms with the traditional Souls control scheme, this is almost certainly not true for everyone. So even though I have no desire for rebindable controls in the Souls games, and even though I feel as though I've made a strong argument as to why the controls don't need to be rebound, it would be irresponsible of me to dismiss this possibility entirely. Indeed, I'm sure there are many people out there who, for reasons relating to, say, physical impairment or something else, would derive great benefit from the ability to rebind the controls. So I would agree that just like every game, the Souls games should have rebindable controls. But for the vast majority of people, there's no need to change what works, and the traditional Souls control scheme works quite well. Sultan Sanctuary, on the other hand, really needs rebindable controls, or at the very least, alternative control schemes. But that brings us to another aspect of the community discourse concerning the controls that I wanted to draw attention to. Whenever the absence of rebindable controls is raised on the Sultan Sanctuary subreddit, for example, at least one person chimes in to point out that the controls are, in fact, rebindable. You just have to use the PS4's accessibility menu to accomplish this. This is, to put it bluntly, not a solution to the problem. Here's what happened when I tried this out during my launch day livestream. Ah, touche to Ugra. That seems... But yeah, I'm gonna go remap the buttons, because this is nonsense. So I hope you all forgive me for this. Alright, I think we're good. Okay, won't let me... It won't let me go back into the game for some reason. Yeah, the Mammoth Tim, I figured that out like 15 seconds before you wrote that message. So I remapped the controls, which meant I was hitting the X button trying to open the app, and it wouldn't open. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? I thought, shouldn't have to do this. Shouldn't have to resort to that. So now the circle button is... So sure, you could simply call my intelligence into question for having failed to account for the fact that I had just remapped the controls. But that's why this isn't a solution. It doesn't eliminate input dissonance, it just replaces one form of input dissonance with another. And this new form of input dissonance doesn't merely affect dashboard navigation, it makes it nearly impossible to navigate the in-game menus. Consider, for example, the status menu. As indicated by the on-screen button prompts, the player can cycle through the status menus with the L2 and R2 triggers. But these button prompts never change, even if you've used the accessibility menu to rebind your controls. So each and every time you open your status menu, you need to remember to use circle and L1 and not L2 and R2 to cycle through the game menus. And this is just one of many examples of the type of input dissonance that is introduced when you remap the controls to the accessibility menu. In short, this solution is no solution at all. It's a recipe for further input dissonance, and all the frustration that comes along with it. And yet, this is a non-solution solution which is suggested every single time someone gripes about the controls in Salt and Sanctuary. Before I started working on this video, for example, I made a post to the Salt and Sanctuary subreddit to ask the developers directly whether they have any intention of patching in the ability to rebind the controls. And even though I bluntly stated in my post that, quote, no, the PS4's accessibility menu is not a solution to the problem, as this renders the in-game menus virtually impossible to navigate by virtue of the unchanged on-screen button prompts, end quote, it only took a few hours for someone to reply by stating that, quote, you can rebind controls to the settings on your PS4 and even add it to the quick menu to turn your alternate scheme on or off, end quote. Now, I want to give this person the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to assume that they were simply just trying to be helpful, and that they weren't consciously endeavoring to downplay the need to address this issue. But it's hard for me to begrudge SCA Studios for having failed to address this issue when complaints of this sort are immediately dismissed by other players. While I don't want to speculate here about what SCA Studios may or may not have been thinking, they didn't reply to my question, and they don't seem to have publicly acknowledged this problem since shortly after the game's release. That is, in a thread on the FexRely forum for Salt and Sanctuary titled Known Issues, SCA Studios stated in March that they do plan to patch in the ability to rebind controls, but added that, quote, in the meantime, PS4 has the option to remap in accessibility, end quote. This is, as I've said several times now, not a solution. It's very important that the developers acknowledge this, and that's not going to happen if we, as a community, continue to pretend that it is a valid solution whenever someone complains about the controls. All of this raises an important question, a question that I actually raised during my launch day livestream. I know that Franz, a German spy, played an early access build of this. A bunch of people played, I think VaatiVidya played an early access build of this game. How is it that none of them said you have to change the fucking controls? I had remembered in that moment that both VaatiVidya and Franz, a German spy, had played very early access copies of the game. But after first learning of the game through VaatiVidya, I held off on watching the videos posted by Franz, a German spy, because I wanted to avoid spoilers. So while VaatiVidya did not mention the control scheme in his preview video, I found that Franz did.
And I suppose now is probably as good a time as any to demonstrate some of the techniques in this game. Although the controls right now are not mapped in quite the same way as the Souls games, I have talked with James about allowing people to remap them, because that's one of the questions that I get most frequently, is whether the devs plan on allowing people to remap the controls to something more familiar to them. Because right now, the R1 button on the DualShock 4 controller is mapped to using items, so that's not very intuitive for Souls players. The attack buttons are actually square for your light attacks and triangle for your heavy attacks. So again, I have talked with James about allowing people to remap those, but for the time being, this is what I'm working with. And again, this is very, very early alpha. Not all of the menu options are even available yet. And again, it's just James doing the coding, guys, so cut him some slack.
So, Franz recommended that something be done about the control scheme more than half a year prior to the release of the game, but SCA Studios opted not to provide any alternatives to its default control scheme. Why? I had a really hard time finding a clear answer to this question, but here's what I did find. James and Michelle Silva joined Lobos Jr. via Skype during his launch day livestream of Salt and Sanctuary, and here's what they said about rebindable controls.
You can remap your buttons on the PlayStation 4 console, right?
Oh, I saw that one too. Yeah, I don't understand why people are so obsessed with wanting to use.
They're really upset about not being able to remap it. So can you actually explain to me, James, why you couldn't just put that in as an option to remap the controller? Other than you just didn't want to. Is it hard to do or what?
Yeah, just more I don't know. I'm not good with that.
The thing is, if the console already does it for you, you can do it on the PS4, so just do that, is kind of my feeling.
Deadly Goddess Await.
Yeah, Deadly Goddess Await.
PS4 provides that because of accessibility, not just because not just because you want to play it as a Soulsy game, but
Oh no.
also it's important for accessibility for people who may not be able to play with their two hands in the same way. It's just an accessibility issue.
I did bad.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
It goes well, Abyss Walker.
Oh.
That's one blessed page down. I got wrecked by the spinny.
A good way to think about it, though, in terms of getting used to the controls, is like Castlevania, right? Like, think about the controls in a 2D game like Castlevania.
Yeah.
And then it makes a lot of sense.
I switch games so much. Like, controls is never a complaint for me.
Yeah, I had a hard time when I was playing The Witcher 3 and Bloodborne at the same time, and switching between those two.
Yeah.
I'd always like accidentally hit the wrong thing, like, oh crap, that's not that button.
Yeah, just going between like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, it's just like, I don't know.
There's little things.
Yeah.
But you adjust to it.
This brief exchange would seem to suggest that, disappointingly, they really didn't put much thought into the controls at all. This is remarkable to me, especially when compared to the tender love and care with which the rest of the game was obviously crafted. Each screen, each encounter, each animation, everything in this game simply oozes atmosphere. In stark contrast to the increasingly soulless, money-grubbing games flooding the market today, this game is clearly, unequivocally, the product of a labor of love. James and Michelle Silva of SCA Studios put so much thought into every single aspect of this game, except, it would seem, for the controls. Putting aside the issue of rebindable controls, why would SCA Studios have deviated from the traditional Souls control scheme to begin with? Well, the best answer I could find comes from someone whose relationship with SCA Studios is unclear at best, so do keep that in mind as we proceed. This explanation comes from a Reddit user named Niata, who described themselves on launch day as helping out over at SCA Studios. Niata replied to a post complaining about the control scheme by stating that, quote, basically it's trying to be its own thing while being heavily inspired, end quote. Insofar as I'm understanding this explanation correctly, and insofar as this person is conveying, however imperfectly, the explanation that was provided to them by the developers themselves, rather than simply speculating about the same, then SCA Studios seems to have landed on its arbitrary control scheme as a means of staking a claim to its own identity, of asserting Salt and Sanctuary as something more than a Dark Souls clone. The problem with this mindset is the going-in assumption that Salt and Sanctuary was ever anything less than its own game. I mean, look at this game. It's a Dark Souls game in 2D, with an art style all its own, and a host of options and features never before seen in a Dark Souls game. Look at this skill tree, for instance. There's nothing like this in any of the Souls games. This game has its own unique style and character, and this is the sort of uncompromising style and character that is only possible in a game like this, developed as a labor of love by a two-person indie dev team. Sure, this game draws heavily on the gameplay mechanics and conceits of the Souls games, but it also draws from a host of other media that the developers are personally interested in. So this game was never merely a Dark Souls clone, it's always been more than that. But even if it was a Dark Souls clone, would that necessarily be a bad thing? I don't think so. After all, it's not like Dark Souls emerged spontaneously from the mind of Hidetaka Miyazaki and simply congealed into a fully formed, finished game. Dark Souls is itself an amalgamation of other media, of other influences, of that which most profoundly influenced its creators. In fact, as revealed in an interview with The Guardian in early 2015, Miyazaki only aspired to become a game developer after having played Ico in the early 2000s, a game he described as having, quote, awoke him to the possibilities of the medium, end quote. But let us turn finally to this second question we raised earlier on. That is, am I at fault for having failed to sufficiently adapt to the arbitrary control scheme that shipped with Salt and Sanctuary? It should be abundantly clear at this point in the video that the answer to this question is, unequivocally, a no. That this game is so strongly associated with the Souls games was not a fabrication of my own mind, it was a deliberate marketing strategy, and though this is almost certainly not true for everyone, this was a marketing strategy which served not only to compel me to purchase the game, but also to problematize its default control scheme. I'm sure that at least some of you must be thinking, but Aegon, why don't you just try harder to adapt? While the less charitable among you might be saying, you just need to get good, bro. To which I can only respond by saying, and I hope you'll forgive my profanity, but fuck that. I'm 30 years old, I'm writing a dissertation, I'm teaching several courses, and I have a personal life too. I play video games to relax, to unwind, to alleviate some of the enormous emotional weight imposed upon me by my work. I don't have the time, nor the energy, to adapt to an arbitrary control scheme that, objectively speaking, really ought to have been far more intuitive. And the more I play Sultan Sanctuary, the more I come to resent the game for demanding, without adequate justification, that I retrain my muscle memory if I wanted to enjoy it. Put simply, get good is never a valid response to critical commentary on this or any other game. This is an offline single-player experience, and there is no logical basis for conceiving of this game in this sort of ultra-competitive, hyper-individualistic manner. What's more is that this is a mindset that is not only unnecessarily combative and exclusionary, it also runs counter to the longevity of the game and serves to misdirect developer priorities. And finally, this is a mindset which presumes that games are universal experiences and that there is only one valid way of interacting with them. That is, you either get good, bro, or you just don't play it. And yet, this is a game that is bursting at the seams with possibility. It is clearly designed to accommodate a wide variety of gamers, a wide variety of playstyles. The act of playing a video game is, without exception, an inherently subjective experience, an experience that is inevitably colored by the particular sensibilities, situatedness, and unique embodied experiences of the player. The subjective nature of gaming experiences is, to put it simply, an unassailable fact. When understood in this context, the notion that one is obliged to get good ceases to have any meaning. Now, before we conclude, I should really address the fact that throughout this entire video, I've used the term Souls genre to refer to something distinct from that which I mean when I say the Souls series, and I've been doing so without actually explaining what this term means to me. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the time at this point in the video to adequately address this definitional issue, so until such time as I'm able to properly address this point in a future episode of this series, we'll just be touching on the aspect of this definition that is most relevant to the foregoing discussion. Games in the Souls genre conceive of death in productive, pedagogical terms. In these games, death is not something to be merely lamented, but also something to learn from. Each time the player dies, they should be able to point to at least one or two actions or decisions which contributed to that death. Equipped with this experiential knowledge, the player is then able to approach the same encounter a second, third, or fourth time, and be able to avoid committing the same errors which led to their initial downfall. This is why the Souls games are capable of engendering such an intoxicating sense of accomplishment. But there is more to the story than the formula we just established. This formula depends on a fundamental level on the existence of intuitive, responsive controls, like that which is present in all of FromSoft's Souls games. When this sense of accomplishment formula is paired with intuitive controls, in other words, the player has no choice but to accept responsibility for their own deaths and thus to learn from them. This ensures that each and every death also doubles as an opportunity for reflection and learning. In the absence of intuitive controls, on the other hand, things become a fair bit more muddy. It becomes more difficult to discern whether the player herself was at fault in her death or whether poor controls were the true culprit. This generates a sense of frustration that, for me at least, left me with an empty feeling after having defeated a boss for the first time. It felt less like I had accomplished something great and more like RNG was simply on my side and I just got lucky. All of this is to say that as a 2D action RPG platformer, Sultan Sanctuary is an absolute triumph. As a Souls game though, Sultan Sanctuary falls short, and that's okay. Objectively speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. As it stands, this is the kind of game I play through once and never pick up again. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Not every game can or should be a Souls game, but I get the distinct sense the developers wanted to create something more, something deeper, a game that could be played over and over and over again, and that with each successive playthrough, you learn something new about the game and about yourself. And though I'm sure the game has accomplished this with many, many players, I, unfortunately, am not among them. Now, let me be absolutely clear. I think that this game is a masterpiece. I know that many of you will interpret this video essay as being unfairly critical of the game, and that some of you might be thinking that after my initial livestream, I should have just stopped playing the game and moved on with my life. And perhaps you're right, but as should be apparent from the amount of time and effort I poured into this video, this is a game I had incredibly high hopes for. This is a game that, despite all that I've said in this video, I care deeply about, and that I respect a great deal. I still can't wrap my head around the fact that this game, in all its indescribable beauty and complexity, was made by just 2 people. By the same token, if you know anything about me, you know that the Souls community is also very near and dear to me. And when I see valid criticism simply dismissed with a "get good," I feel compelled to speak out about it. The mindset underlying this absurd notion runs counter to all that I love about this community: its collaborative nature, its sense of inclusivity and diversity, and the space it provides for productive, meaningful discourse. From within this discursive space, we can learn not only about the games we play, but about ourselves as a community, as individuals. So the next time you feel compelled to tell someone to get good, stop yourself and try to actually engage in a discussion with that person. You'll find that you might actually learn something through that exchange, and that the generative insight thus produced can only serve in the long term to improve the games we all love by allowing us to more clearly articulate to game developers that which we like or dislike about their games. Get good doesn't help anyone and doesn't accomplish anything other than perhaps putting the other person down. You know what does help? Actually talking these things through. In closing, there is a lot to love about Salt and Sanctuary, its world, and its mechanics. There's so much about this game I want to explore, so much I want to learn, so much to be experienced. I would love nothing more than to simply immerse myself in this game world, to explore its many intricacies. But each and every time I endeavor to do just that, my controller gets in the way.